So what exactly are we up to in this class? By week 5, that is a question that should arise, correct? Are we learning lists of the elements and constituents of drama or narrative or fiction or the short story or the novel or the poem or some subset of a genre or not a subset of a genre, the genre boldly at large? We're headed soon to find out something about poetry, of course. No. I mean, you can tell that I have not been distributing, I think you would have noticed, if I'd been distributing lists of generic criteria. We have been interested in generic criteria. We've been interested in specific generic criteria, the drama, the chorus, for example, of the tragedy, right? But we have not been exhaustive. We have not felt that, or I have not felt, and maybe you've noticed this, I have not felt that it is our ambition in this class for you to learn all about the various elements of genre, any particular genre, drama, tragedy. A course in tragedy would be the course in which you would learn all the various elements of tragedy. We're learning, this will be maybe no surprise to some of you who are seniors, I think we have a few of you in the class. We're learning what you already know, right? A lot of it. That there are such genres, there are such elements of such genres. We're also learning something that I think you sort of know, easy to forget, in part because you've internalized it to a certain degree, or you will internalize it, right? And it's something that has to be known, I think, has to be grasped at a certain level, as I'm calling it here, the more sophisticated and firmer collegiate college level manner required of majors and minors. And what is that? It's that it pays to know about these elements of genre, right? These characteristics of the various genres, these dynamics of the subgenres, these mechanics of the various literary forms. Boy, does it pay. Boy, does it pay when you approach the reading of an individual work of art with some awareness, okay, of the tradition. We're going to get to that down the road here in this class. At this point, we're just looking at the genres themselves, not so much the tradition of what's been said, but the kinds of things that have been said, that have been written, right, and established. Boy, does it help to know a little bit about those dynamics, okay, those mechanics, the elements, of course, that in fact dynamically, okay, are present to us as we read a play like Trifles, right? I'm not going to go back to Trifles. Rather go to the plot-story distinction for a good example at this point, though there are numerous such good examples. What we've been doing up to this point in the course is accumulating good examples of these various elements of mostly drama up to this point. Now we're with fiction and narrative, right? These various elements that knowledge of which tremendously enhances the reading experience, okay? And the experience of understanding literature and the experience of appreciating literature at its, at a higher level, at a level that is to be expected of educated people who have been to college, okay? And especially when they're English majors and minors, although I think that the kind of thing we're doing in a class like this is, has a more general kind of application, perhaps, but we won't get into that right now. The plot-story distinction offers a good example. To be aware that such exists, simply that very sophisticated readers, okay, although the distinction doesn't depend upon your being sophisticated. I think even if you're not very sophisticated, at some level it's working on you, okay? You're just not aware enough of it for it to really be of much aid to you. This distinction, okay, that has been of such importance to, let's call them more experienced readers, okay, of narrative, to be mindful of it as we read is to put ourselves in a position to see certain things that we're otherwise not going to see, okay? And just, again, this is just one example. This is the plot-story opposition. When you're aware of it, are you not more aware than you otherwise would be of the question of causality? The plot-story opposition foregrounds the matter of causality? Y'all seem to think so. You do even when it appears that you don't. For example, Joanna notes how plot summaries tend to offer more detail. Carly would seem to concur, details of description and narrative tone and more. But reread. She also notes how plot, as it goes into more detail, gets more interested in how and why one thing, whether factor or effect, leads to or follows another, quote, as a result. We have a word for all that. Causation. I have quoted above Forster's not archaic sense of the term or a version of the term causality. I'm impressed with your subtlety of response to Forster's simplicity. A helpful simplicity, but a simplicity nonetheless. Is story not at all interested in motivation and the why of an event? Isn't it more of a matter of emphasis? Story is more interested in what than why. Plot more interested in why than what. It is wrong to say that story summaries, sometimes referred to as plot summaries, by the way. Your professor says, this is just all plot summary. Typically, it's saying it's all story summary. It's wrong to say that story summaries don't make any mention of motivation, because I think they do. I'm going to give you a quick one here. You'll recognize it. She found out her husband was still alive, was so happy she died on the spot. Notice how the why is mentioned in passing and is not omitted entirely. It's actually fairly difficult to tell a story without at least glancing at motivation. You're just not very interested in it. You're a lot more interested in the what than in the why, or even the how. Note how Therese betrays awareness of this refinement of the Forster principle. So I don't think Forster would disagree with us if we pushed him on this, if he were here. Therese says, quote, looking at the ending line, quote, when the doctors came, they said she had died of heart disease, of the joy that kills. Without the context of the rest of the story, a reader would think that Mrs. Mallard learned her husband died and was so overjoyed to discover him alive that she passed away. It'd be a little bit like the plot summary I offered a moment ago. The plot, however, disagrees. I have to say it's one of my favorite four-line segments in the entire discussion board this time. The plot, however, disagrees. It begs to differ. I think that's put so well. Plot and story often, quote, disagree in a sense that they do not coincide. Here in Chopin, we have disagreement to the degree that it's not a matter of simply not agreeing or not coinciding. They quarrel. The story is so busy telling us what? Says that she died of joy, joy of the sort or of the intensity that can kill. We walk away thinking to the extent that we're thinking at all. I guess I learned something about joy today. Mostly what you just did was have the experience of the story. Okay, the whatness of it. And you probably stood back a little bit and marveled that such things happen. But to the extent that you're thinking at all and you're learning at all, what are you thinking? Well, you're probably thinking about joy, and you're learning something about joy, which is just how intense it can get, so intense that it can kill, which is quite an irony. I'm so excited to see what happens, and I might miss a detail, though, right, with this story orientation on the short fiction. That motive, joy, ascribed to Mrs. Mallard, is ascribed. This is easy to miss if you're, rushing past, you're just pushing past and pushing on to the what next, what happened next. Right? It's easy to miss this detail that, in fact, it's the doctors who say that. It is not the narrator who says that she died of joy. What does the plot say? Well, what does the plot do? I think to the extent that we're attentive to the plot as opposed to the story, and it's Kate Chopin's The Story of an Hour. You walk away thinking. That's the first thing to say, really thinking. What are you thinking? Joy schmoy. This is a story about disappointment. It's disappointment that does the killing here, not joy. And I now decide that to explain what has happened here, we really do need to move past intensity, which was, in a sense, the intensity of joy is what kills, to the question of, that's a question of quantity, to a question of quality, of sort or kind. It's the sort of disappointment. I mean, you could make an argument that it's the intensity of disappointment here. The disappointment, when it's intense enough, can kill. But I think it's a sort of disappointment that's more at issue, to a more thoughtful attention to the short fiction, which is one that would be interested in the plot as opposed to merely the story. It's the sort of disappointment that is at issue here. Disappointment of one's hopes for the future, of one's anticipation of freedom, as a number of you noticed. Caitlin, for example, quote, the plot centers around her feeling free. Reconfinement, subsequent to a taste of freedom, or the promise of freedom, can kill. So necessary to human existence is freedom. You can see how this is different from what Story told us. What Story told us here and telling us something about the short fiction. What Story told us was a short fiction about the power of human joy. What Story told us was a short fiction about the power of human joy. Plot tells us is truly a short fiction about our need to be free. And you can see how these are very different things. I like Jessica's notion that, speaking of stories, all this is by the way, Mrs. Mallard upon Brentley's death finds that, quote, her story's about to begin. She dies then of finding herself storyless, but only after finding herself suddenly storied, correct? She would not have died. I mean, she has the bad heart, we know, but this probably would not have been enough of a shock to destroy her if she had not been anticipating this freedom, right? To have heard that he had died and maybe have heard before she had a chance to meditate on his death and what it meant for her going forward and the freedom that had fallen to her by way of the death, the shock, there would have been shock, but probably not of the sort. I don't know that it really would have been a lot of difference in intensity, if you see what I'm saying, but there would have been of a different sort, the shock that she gets there at the end. And it would not have been the shock of disappointment at finding herself storyless, which has such shock only after she has suddenly found herself storied, right? Because, you know, her problem before was that she was just storied. Her life had no plot. And this points us to something I'd like to say here is that I'd like Jessica's statement. It would be more in fitting with our sense of the two terms and how we're using them and how Forster wants us to use them, and not just Forster, but others. If for story here, we read plot, right? Now, sometimes we are going to, as Jessica did, quite, you know, one should feel quite free to do this, is now and then to substitute, not in our class, okay, but amongst laypersons, right? They're going to be using stories sometimes when they need plot. And I think that's all that Jessica was doing in this moment. It is now and then used by people as a substitute for the word plot. But of course, we're being more precise because we're English majors and minors. A couple of slightly different but not discordant themes that emerge from a plot-wise consideration of Chopin's Story of an Hour. Note how Sarah identifies a slightly different, if not discordant theme, by noting what the supposedly grieving Mrs. Mallard sees as she looks out of the window. As Tiffany notes, such details as what she does indeed see when she looks out of the window, are crucial clues. She's quoting Harfman and Abrams. Quote, Sarah writes, the detailed and romanticized nature of these mundane objects. That's what she sees when she looks out of the window. And there's a strong impression that the last time she looked out of the window, prior to the death of her husband, she did not see anything that was romanticized. She saw the mundane. As Sarah continues, such, quote, is not what one would expect from a grieving window, and it signifies an increasing clarity in Mrs. Mallard, and I would argue, an increasing clarity in Mrs. Mallard on the question of Mrs. Mallard. Jill concurs, quote, seeing her life through a new lens brings a joy she hadn't considered. And she's aware of these things. She's considering this joy. She's also considering that new lens. She's aware that she's wearing a new lens. So she's coming to consciousness of all this as the story continues. And that is, in fact, the midsection of the story, the extended middle of the story, as a matter of fact, is devoted to this progression and to this development. And I think this progression, this development would be easy to discount, or you wouldn't overlook it entirely. You just wouldn't find it that interesting if you, in fact, were going story-wise on this short fiction and weren't being plot-wise. Mrs. Mallard is coming to self-knowledge. She's doing so by observing her own authentic, unmediated vision of the world. It does matter that she's alone at this point. And to the extent that we become aware of these little details, we become aware of this way of making sense, this particular sense that may be made of these particular details. A certain theme emerges. I want to give the credit to that theme. I want to give the credit for that theme and its emergence to, in fact, the plot-wise consideration of this short fiction. Here is that theme. The virtue of solitude. That is a theme. The virtue of solitude emerges as a theme, as does the falsifying pressures of social expectation and convention. I don't think that needs a lot of explanation. She has to be alone. She's got to be solitary. If she has all these, well-meaning people around her, they are going to be, without intending to do so, they're just going to be expecting her to feel a certain way, right? And they're going to, in the process of that expectation of, and once again, there's nothing hostile about this, and there's nothing even very willful about it. I mean, it's just simply very natural when someone has lost a loved one for those around her or him, right, to behave in a certain way. And we can see that in this case, that would have been in such a way as perhaps to conceal from her, okay, her own authentic feelings that have cropped up and that become very evident to her, almost readable in the landscape. As she looks at it and she sees that the landscape, which is the landscape of bereavement, is in fact a place of wonder and not a place of emptiness. Another such just different, it's a different, if not discordant theme. Quote, this is Maria, men and women oppress each other, even if it's our love or our kindness. And in fact, I think that's very true. And it's something very easy to overlook as we make our way through the story, that Chopin is, I think she's, what's the word? Daring, is that it? Speaking of the defiance of social expectation and convention. I think she's very brave. I think she's courageous in a recognition of certain truths that are just very painful, I think, and disturbing to recognize. For example, that love and freedom can be at odds, right? And this came out in one of the quiz questions, right? That there's absolutely zero reason to think that Brentley does not love his wife. I realize that there are you can infer certain things from what happens, right? But it's made very clear, and the story seems to depend upon this to a degree, right? The theme seems to depend upon this. The plot seems to depend upon this, and to make it clear that love and freedom can be at odds. That he is not a bad husband. He's a wonderful husband. He's a loving husband, okay? But the love that he brings to her is itself cramping and confining and oppressive. Now, you could say, oh, it's just his will. It's because he's the kind of guy he is. And I'm open to that possibility, by the way. I'm open to that counter argument. But it does seem to me that she's suggesting that, there's something about love. I mean, she's not saying it's always like this. She's not saying that in every case of love between people, the beloved is losing freedom, even as he or she, in that love, enjoys the pleasure and joy of love itself. There's a cost. Chopin seems to be very interested in and very ready to recognize, this kind of painful truth that love is not free, shall we say, right? It costs the lover, and it also costs the beloved, the object, right? Not always do we, when loving a thing, set it free. Yeah, and so to put a capstone on what I've just been saying, Chopin's story emerges by way of a plot-wise consideration of the short fiction as a story about love as well as freedom, and about individuality as well as love. Okay, well, this week I promised to keep it brief. I know I've said that before and then I've gone on, but this time I mean it. Because we're so late in the week and I still need to post your granular modular schedule in addition to what has finally been posted. I thought it was about time that I provided this with you. It's just the schematic schedule of when the assignments are due, which you will find in the information drawer. But let me just briefly say here, putting a capstone on our discussion, which we will immediately remove going forward here, right? Because I hope this is something that you've noticed, that we're never really done with anything. Now, we're going to be sort of done with Antigone, okay? I will admit. But we stay interested in things for a while, don't we? And I hope that makes you feel that, hey, the reading I'm doing really does kind of bear fruit, right? Well, we still need to talk about plotters. The title, of course, of this video, Plots and Plotters. Montresor, for example, is a plotter. So is Poe, and Poe's plot is not equal to Montresor's plot. Montresor plots against Fortunato. Poe plots against Montresor. Well, that Montresor is a real character, you may feel. I don't know, though. I mean, Joanna says that he's doing it on a petty whim. Maria says superficial. Chris, a lack of complex motivation. Carly wasn't too sure about it, even though she wasn't sure what the depths were. She says, I'm assuming there is some sort of serious motivation there. And I don't know. I don't know that I'm really going to be able to provide an answer to the question of what the motivation is, but I do believe that we have evidence to back up what Carly is saying, which is that it is there. It is there. Depths are revealed, even if they're not explored. This Montresor, this cool cat, right, who's got such style that he can, in that moment, you a Mason? Yes, yes, yes. And he pulls a trowel out, because it pretends, in a sense, to display the symbol of the Masons, which is this kind of secret society, and is having his own little fun, his own little joke at the expense of Fortunato, because what he's doing is, in fact, displaying to him the tool he will use to destroy it, right? You may feel, okay, he's a character, he's capable of these little things, he's like Mr. Ripley, the talented Mr. Ripley, if you ever saw those films, or I suppose there's any number of movies these days that puts on display, right? Some stylish murderers who really have no emotional depth and have very simple, motives for doing what they're doing, and the motives are not explored, and you don't get the feeling there's really much depth there to be explored. And you may feel the same way about Montresor, right? But I'm wondering about that. Don't we become aware of certain depths to the extent that you saw this coming. Read for the plot. See how all these things are linked up? Reading plot-wise, character emerges in a way that it doesn't when we read story-wise, right? Depths of motivation, by way of our attention to causation, depths of motivation emerge. And you can see how this would work, can you not? Reading plot-wise, we stop and ask, why is Montresor telling us all this? Wait, who is he telling all this, right? And he addresses this invisible auditor and also the silent auditor at one point. He says, you who so well know the nature of my soul. And you wonder who this person is. Why include certain details, ones which are easily missed when we rapidly read through for the what, correct? When we read for story. How he answers, for example, for the love of God, and then waits impatiently for a reply. Why? Right? Depth of motivation emerges as we read plot-wise. Character emerges, real character. He pauses impatiently for a reply. If he were just interested in, offing this guy, you would think there wouldn't be a lot of, there wouldn't be moments like this, right? And I think this moment is not to be confused with, for example, that earlier moment where we just see his cruelty emerging in his sadism, where you will recall Fortunato is shaking his chains, and Montresor stops walling him up for the moment, stops using his trowel and sits down so that he can better enjoy, listening to Fortunato's desperation. I think most of us would regard that as cruel and as a sign of nastiness, right? And of just real deep hatred of this guy that's coming across in those moments. I don't know that I see that here in this impatient patience, because he doesn't, it's complex, isn't it? He doesn't put the last brick in place, but patiently, it's actually impatient, his waiting, but he's patient in his, if you will see what I'm saying, consummation of his plot, right? Patient, his impatience to hear something from Fortunato that I don't think is simply another example of desperation, right? He's gotten plenty of that at this point. Got plenty of that sort of cruel satisfaction. Is probably not the motive. So you see this complexity of motive emerging in those moments. And then at the very end, Montresor recalls the end of his recount, his narration of this event to some auditor. Montresor recalls feeling, quote, sick at heart, just as he's finishing the job. But he quickly adds, if you'll pay attention to those final couple of paragraphs or 3 paragraphs, he quickly adds, as if feeling the need to control his auditor's understanding. He says it was due to the, quote, the dampness of the catacombs, as though he wants to conceal what he has just admitted. from his auditor. He's revealed some aspect of his motive that he's uncomfortable with revealing. And what does that do but, in fact, prompt us to ask yet again, what's his motive? Because what he is doing here is not simply killing a guy. He could have killed him by stabbing him with his rapier as soon as they entered into the catacombs and just, dragged him. I realize that there's the practical matter of that being difficult to do. But he could have killed him when they got there. He didn't have to chain him up. There's some complexity here, that's involved in the event itself, if you see what I'm saying. It's not simply killing the guy. He wants to do it in a certain way. He wants to punish him, as he puts it earlier. And I think there's a complex feeling about the actual act of punishment as he's going about it. I don't think his heart is 100% in it. As inexorable as he is, I think there's some part of him that's standing outside of the experience and is not tremendously, delighted, and is not, fully fine with what he's doing. Because just before he finishes, he grows heartsick at what he himself is doing. Not that he interrupts what he's doing, but we see this complexity of motive emerge to the extent that we see that the act of killing Fortunato is not simply that of killing him. It's of doing something fairly complexly motivated. That's it.